5 questions in 5 minutes. Recycling, manufacturing, and innovation. This is 5 for 5. Welcome to another edition of 5 for 5. Today, I'm joined by Matt Rohm. He's the CEO of MX Holdings. He's also one of the founding members of the newly formed organization SACA, or the Secondary Aluminum Coalition for America, a group focused on bolstering our domestic recycling capacity. Welcome to 5 for 5, Matt.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate you having me on today.
Of course, I'm excited about this conversation. So let's get started with the first question. SACA started from a pretty personal place for you. Tell me about the moment that you realized that something like this needed to exist and what others should take away from that experience.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is pretty personal. It goes back to August of 2024. As a company, we were starting to track some metrics relative to the consumer debt issues, right? And at the time, we were seeing increases in consumer delinquencies on, car payments, mortgage payments, credit card delinquencies. We're nearing kind of, financial crisis type levels. And so we started to track that. And obviously our concern was around consumers being able to afford products with aluminum in it. Mark Butterfield, president of MX Aluminum, was at a town hall near our plant in Youngstown, Ohio. He had an employee approach him after the town hall. Their biggest concern was really that they couldn't even afford school supplies for their kids. And that hit me real hard. A person working at our facilities could not afford a number 2 pencil for their kids. There's no way they could afford aluminum-based products, whether it's a Bev can, a Ford F-150, a new aluminum deck on their back of their house. So it got to be a real concern for us on how can we get aluminum to be affordable. And keep in mind, this is still when aluminum tariffs in 232 are at 10%. Since that time, the price of aluminum has more than doubled. Yeah. And so this problem has just gotten worse. So for us, we wanted to make sure that aluminum would be a product that we want all consumers to be able to afford, especially the folks that are actually making the product itself.
So that's really impactful that you guys were there and had those conversations and then actually decided to do something about it. So tell me, as you and your team structured SACA, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of associations out there. This one's unique. So tell me why you structured it the way that you did.
So really, we started to think about this more than a year ago. And again, really focused on how do we continue to make aluminum an affordable product for consumers at the end of the day. And we're pretty unique in that we've got a view on the trading side of metals with metal exchange. And then obviously downstream, we're recycling aluminum into billet and extruding and fabricating that as well through Pennex. So we are pretty involved in a lot of different industry associations. REMA, of course, with metal exchange. And metal exchange is also a part of the Aluminum Association as well as Pennex is in the Aluminum Extruder Council. So we've got a good view into what all those different industry groups are doing. But we felt like across all 3 of those specific to aluminum, there wasn't just a real pointed effort specifically on secondary. So over the last 16 to 18 months, we've been talking to groups who basically cover all 3 of those different industry associations and said, maybe we should really formalize a coalition and really come together as a bigger organization to advocate for secondary. And so when you look at the companies that make up SACA, they're primarily middle market companies, mostly privately held or ESOP owned, that really care about aluminum long term. What we don't care about is short-term earnings per share. We don't think with a short-term mentality. We think long-term in mind. And the other thing is all these companies care about each other, even though we compete and we're obviously cautious on how we talk about certain things. But the one unifying thing we do care about is the long-term viability of the aluminum industry in the U.S. And we'll put our own self-needs second for the industry. And that's how every single member of this coalition thinks.
Love it. So let's talk a little more about that in depth then. So as you've had these conversations with these other companies, obviously the topic of the gap in aluminum supply domestically has come up a lot. Why should a U.S. company care about closing that gap, whether or not they're actually even part of SACA?
Yeah, it's really important to understand how big the gap is, right? So as of 2024, the gap was 3.7 million tons of unwrought aluminum. So billet, slab, ingot, coming from offshore. to fill the demand needs of the United States. Now, the good news is we've closed that gap since then. So we've had billet expansion in Minnesota. We've had 2 new rolling mills announced, and one's already operational. That's helping close the gap. We've had Century on the primary side, increased capacity in South Carolina, magnitude 7 in Cape Girardeau, Missouri is going to come back online by the end of the year. Then obviously we've got the primary smelter expansion in Oklahoma, which is about 750,000 tons. All great. All those things help close that gap, but not enough to close the entire gap. And that's where the secondary side of the equation can come in. And so it's important to know downstream where we melt and cast, pretty easy to get some of that CapEx into the ground and get that into service. But it's really around the folks that are mostly upstream on how we collect and trade and sort and clean. There's still a lot of opportunity from that diverse group of companies that are out there to get involved, because the upstream is by far the most important component of this coalition. Because again, the downstream side of this is pretty easy to do. There's technology is pretty proven. We know the demand is there, but getting access to that scrap and how those companies that can be involved, who we know, Tim, are pretty geographically dispersed all over the country. That's where there's power for those in those spaces to become part of this, or at least start to work with SACA on how they can help and how we can help them as well.
Okay, well, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Talking about casting and melting. That's really how a lot of the conversation around SACA gets framed. But you'd argue, like you said, that the upstream matters just as much. Can you dive into that a little more for me?
So this coalition was in Washington, D.C. about 5 weeks ago. And we had a lot of meetings with a lot of different folks and lawmakers. And one of the things that it seems the lawmakers were pretty informed on was scrap. And I think what we could read from the room is that we're slowly getting to the point where they're acknowledging scrap as a critical material as well. And so we talked a lot about the expansion on remelts and casting, but the commentary that we provided to the lawmakers was that capacity is only as good as the ability to get the scrap units upstream. So it's really a focus on around how do we keep the units from entering a landfill or entering a salvage yard? How do we get those units out of a landfill today and out of a salvage yard and back into the supply chain on remelt and cast? So that was pretty well understood. And, as a coalition, a lot of our focus will be on educating folks in DC and then trying to get more involved with those that are in those upstream areas and making sure that we are thinking about policies and incentives that really drive investment in the upstream side of the business.
So then tell me, let's look 5 years from now, right? If SACA is successful, what does the aluminum industry look like at that time?
Well, obviously, we want to close the gap, right? So if we can get to the point where we can close that gap, then we're a little less reliant on some of the trade policies that have been put in place. So if supply can equal demand, that's the ideal situation. And that's really what we're pushing for. And again, alongside the primary expansions that have been announced, we can help both close that gap. One of our biggest concerns as a coalition is the potential for demand destruction and substitution of aluminum. And if they stay at these pricing levels for a long period of time, there's a much higher potential or a much higher risk of those things happening. And that puts the whole industry in a pretty bad situation. So for us, getting that supply demand imbalance, getting aluminum prices to moderate, and continuing to advocate for aluminum as a substrate of choice when consumers, customers have the ability to choose, we want to make sure aluminum is going to be at the forefront of that selection.
Well, it's a big job. It's a super important mission. And I wish you and your team at SACA the best of luck. And I'm excited to see where you guys take this thing. So thanks a lot for joining me today, Matt.
Tim, appreciate it, man. Anytime.